Formula One is bigger than ever. Every race weekend, millions of people watch 20 drivers push the fastest machines on Earth to their limits. Teams spend fortunes chasing fractions of a second. Fans argue over strategy, rivalries, and championships. For many people, this is Formula One. But the sport didn't begin like this. Long before the lights, the crowds, and the technology, Formula One was something very different. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes even chaotic. The truth is, the story of Formula One is far more dramatic than most people realize, because this sport wasn't just built by engineers and teams. It was shaped by risk, innovation, and the drivers who were willing to push beyond what anyone thought was possible. And that is exactly what this series is about. From the earliest days of racing machines to the modern era of global championships, the breakthroughs, the rivalries, the moments that changed the sport forever, and the drivers who paid the ultimate price along the way, this is the complete story of Formula One. And to understand where it is today, we have to go back to the very beginning. This is the very first episode of Formula One, so let's start. Long before roaring crowds and glowing red start lights, speed was a question no one had answered. Europe was changing. Machines were appearing on roads that had never known engines before. Early automobiles rattled through towns like mechanical experiments, fragile and unpredictable. Drivers gripped thin steering wheels while engines shook the chassis beneath them. Every journey felt uncertain. Every mile felt like discovery. Naturally, curiosity followed. If these machines could move, how fast could they truly go? Soon the experiments left public roads and turned into contests. Manufacturers gathered their newest creations and pushed them harder than any normal road would allow. These were not races for fame or entertainment. They were tests of survival for machines that barely understood speed. Then, in 1906, something shifted. The French Grand Prix introduced structure to the chaos. For the first time, international motor racing had rules, timing systems, and defined competition. The idea was simple but powerful. Speed alone was not enough. It needed boundaries. That idea would eventually give birth to a word that would define the sport: formula. Through the 1920s and 1930s, racing grew louder and faster. Engines roared with more power each year. Cars became lighter, sharper, more dangerous. Drivers pushed beyond the limits of both machine and understanding. Then everything stopped. War spread across Europe and the circuits fell silent. Factories that once built racing cars turned to building machines of conflict. Tracks disappeared under dust and neglect. For years, the sound of racing vanished. When the war ended, Europe faced a different kind of rebuilding. Cities needed hope. Nations needed progress. Movement itself became symbolic. Motorsport returned with that spirit. In 1946, racing authorities created a new top category for the fastest machines on Earth. One international standard, one global stage, Formula One. 4 years later, on May 13, 1950, engines fired into life at Silverstone in England. The first official world championship race began, but Formula One was not born into safety. It was born into danger. The early championship seasons were brutal. Circuits were not designed for high-speed racing. Some were converted airfields left behind by the war. Others were public roads temporarily closed for competition. Trees stood beside the racing line. Stone buildings loomed nearby. Grass and dirt waited just beyond the edge of the track. There were no modern crash barriers, no advanced rescue teams, no helicopters waiting overhead. Drivers stepped into cars that seemed almost violent in their design. Seatbelts were absent. Fuel tanks surrounded the cockpit. Brakes faded under pressure. Helmets were little more than thin leather caps. Some drivers believed that being thrown from the car was safer than staying inside it. Yet the speeds were extraordinary. Cars blasted down straights at more than 270 kilometers per hour. Engines screamed. Tires struggled for grip. Every lap balanced control against catastrophe. Among those early drivers were men who would shape the legend of the sport. Giuseppe Farina claimed the first championship. Juan Manuel Fangio followed with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Their skill behind the wheel bordered on impossible. But Formula One was changing already. Behind the drivers, inside workshops and garages, engineers were beginning to influence the outcome of races. Cars evolved. Engines moved behind the driver. Balance improved. Handling sharpened. Teams realized something important. Victory could be engineered. Constructors became as vital as the drivers themselves. Mechanics transformed into designers. Racing slowly turned into a collaboration between instinct and calculation. At speeds approaching 300 kilometers per hour, Formula One was becoming something new. Not just a race, a technological competition, but the circuits remained trapped in the past. Tracks wound through forests and villages. Telephone poles stood beside corners. Stone walls waited inches away. A small mistake could end a career, or a life. Still, the sport moved forward. Because speed has a strange gravity. Once discovered, it is almost impossible to resist. By the 1960s, Formula One had found its identity. Courage still mattered, but engineering had become equally powerful. Every season introduced faster machines and sharper ideas. Then a quiet discovery changed everything. The air itself could be used. For years, air had been treated as resistance, something cars had to fight against. But engineers began to see another possibility. If shaped correctly, airflow could press the car downward into the track. More grip, more stability, more speed through corners. At first, the change was subtle. Body shapes shifted. Small design adjustments appeared. Engineers experimented quietly. Then wings arrived. Tall, narrow structures mounted above the engine. They looked fragile and almost temporary, as if they had been borrowed from aircraft. But they worked. Suddenly, cars could take corners faster than ever before. Speeds rose dramatically. Racing began to resemble aviation science as much as driving skill. Wind tunnels entered the sport. Calculations replaced guesswork. Engineers gained influence that rivaled the drivers. Formula One had entered the aerodynamic age, and the consequences were immediate. Cars were now faster, sharper, more precise than anything before them, but the world around them had not changed. Narrow circuits twisted through towns. Rural roads cut between trees and buildings. Protection often consisted of stacked hay bales, hiding the solid dangers behind them. It was like placing jet aircraft onto country roads. Drivers felt it the moment they pushed the new machines. Corners that once demanded caution were suddenly flat out. Reaction times shrank to fractions of a second. Small mistakes became violent impacts. Yet crowds grew larger. The cars looked futuristic. The speeds defied belief. Drivers appeared fearless, almost mythical. Inside the cockpit, the reality was different. Every lap lived on the edge of control. For years, danger had been accepted as part of the sport. It was simply the price of speed. But now something was changing. The risks were growing faster than anyone expected. Conversations began quietly in paddocks and garages. Drivers spoke about barriers, about circuit safety, about medical response, not complaints. Realization. Formula One had crossed a threshold. The sport had discovered how to go faster. Now it faced a new question: how to survive it. And the answer to that question would reshape Formula One forever. The next era was coming, and it would test the sport like never before. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Formula One series.